It began with a silence so heavy you could almost hear the weight of every breath in the room. The cameras were already rolling, the microphones crackling with static, and the sharp, sterile glow of overhead lights pressed down on the chamber like an interrogation lamp. Sarah Huckabee Sanders leaned forward, lips tight, eyes narrowed, and with a sudden burst of sharpness, she hurled the insult that would set the stage for one of the most unforgettable confrontations of her career. "You stand there and lecture me about values," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain, "yet you represent chaos and dishonesty every single day." Gasps rippled through the room like a shockwave. The crowd shifted, reporters' pens froze mid-sentence, and for a split second, time seemed to hang in suspension. Sanders had chosen the weapon she always reached for, condescension, packaged as certainty. And for a moment, it almost worked. But then, all eyes turned toward Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Sitting perfectly still, framed by the cold white lights, she allowed the silence to stretch, let it coil around Sanders' words like a snake tightening its grip. Her calm was not weakness, it was strategy. You could see it in the tilt of her head, the subtle half-smile tugging at her lips. This wasn't a woman caught off guard, this was a woman waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The atmosphere thickened. A low murmur spread across the audience, the kind of whispered electricity that always precedes something historic. Cameras zoomed closer, catching every flicker of tension in Sanders' jaw, every flicker of poise in Crockett's gaze. Even the air felt charged, as if the entire room knew it was on the edge of witnessing a collapse, or a triumph. Control. But the harder she pushed, the clearer it became that she was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Crockett hadn't spoken yet, and already she was winning. Because sometimes power isn't in the words you throw like daggers. Sometimes it's in the silence that makes your opponent cut themselves deeper with every syllable. And then, as the tension reached its breaking point, Crockett leaned forward, ready to speak. But what happened next would silence the entire room. The moment Sanders' words cut through the air, it became clear this was not just another exchange between two politicians. This was a collision of two very different Americas. On one side stood Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the daughter of political royalty, molded in the crucible of privilege, her career built on loyalty to power rather than loyalty to people. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, the freshman congresswoman who had carved her path not through name recognition, but through grit, relentless work, and a fiery defense of those whose voices were too often silenced. The stakes were bigger than Sanders' insult. This was about what kind of leadership the country was willing to reward. Would it applaud the recycled arrogance of establishment politics, or would it rally behind a new generation of women who carried the fight for justice on their shoulders? Sanders had long presented herself as the torchbearer of traditional values, boasting of family honor, discipline, and moral clarity. But her record as governor told a different story: policies that gutted public education, legislation that targeted marginalized communities, and rhetoric that stoked division instead of unity. She had weaponized the language of patriotism, but when examined closely, her version of American values was built to exclude. Crockett, by contrast, had lived on the front lines of the struggles Sanders dismissed. As a civil rights lawyer, she had defended those punished simply for existing while poor, black, or immigrant. She brought that lived experience with her into Congress, carrying not only her own story but the stories of millions who rarely saw themselves represented in the halls of power. For her, politics was not performance. It was survival, justice, and truth. And this was the precise fault line now exposed in that chamber, one woman clinging to power through hypocrisy, and another rising with authenticity and courage. It mattered for American politics because this wasn't just Sanders versus Crockett. This was establishment versus insurgent, old guard versus new blood, gatekeeping versus representation. It mattered for women in leadership, because too often women like Sanders, aligned with the machinery of privilege, were elevated as proof of progress, while women like Crockett, outspoken, unafraid, rooted in marginalized realities, were told to wait their turn. It mattered for public trust, because the nation was weary of hypocrisy. Americans had watched leaders who preached morality while breaking it, who promised transparency while ruling in secrecy. Every contradiction Sanders embodied was exactly what had left so many disillusioned with politics in the first place. That was why Crockett's silence, her patience, her calm before the storm carried so much weight. She wasn't just responding to Sanders. She was answering every insult ever thrown at communities told they didn't belong, every sneer ever directed at those who fought to be heard, every attempt to weaponize identity against those who dared to lead with it. The chamber was no longer just a stage for two politicians. It had become a battlefield for the soul of American leadership. Reporters sensed it. Staffers whispered about it. Even Sanders herself, behind the facade of confidence, seemed to realize she was standing not just against a woman, but against a movement. And yet, outside that chamber, millions of Americans went about their day unaware of what was unfolding. They didn't know that in this moment, two women would embody two futures, one rooted in fear, the other in dignity. The nation had no idea that a debate in this chamber would soon become headline news. To understand why Sarah Huckabee Sanders unraveled so visibly in that chamber, you first have to trace the path that brought her there. Hers is a story shaped not by struggle, but by inheritance, the daughter of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, raised in the comfort of political corridors, mentored not by teachers of humility but by the machinery of power itself. Politics wasn't a calling for her, it was the family business. Her national profile erupted during the Trump presidency, when she stepped into the White House briefing room as press secretary. Day after day, she stood behind that podium, trading facts for spin, dismissing reporters with curt smiles and a rehearsed sense of superiority. Where others might have faltered under the weight of defending the indefensible, Sanders made it her brand. She became a master at doubling down, at shifting blame, at turning honest questions into perceived attacks. To her supporters, that stubbornness looked like strength. To her critics, it was shamelessness dressed up as duty. When she left Washington and returned home to Arkansas, she carried with her that same defiance. Campaigning for governor, she wrapped herself in the rhetoric of faith, family, and freedom, portraying herself as the last bulwark against the creeping decay of liberal America. It was a performance polished to perfection, the dutiful daughter, the mother, the Christian, the conservative warrior. The imagery was carefully crafted to evoke nostalgia for a simpler, purer America, even as her policies promised division. Once elected, the contradictions sharpened. She promised to protect Arkansas families, then slashed funding for public schools that parents relied on. She spoke of defending children, yet championed legislation that stripped away protections for LGBTQ youth. She demanded transparency, but her administration fought tooth and nail to keep financial dealings and travel records from public view. Again and again, she wielded the language of values while hollowing out the very meaning of them. For Sanders, politics became less about solving problems and more about creating enemies. Teachers, journalists, immigrants, activists, all were painted as threats to the Arkansas she claimed to defend. And every time criticism arose, she reached for the same shield, victimhood. In her telling, the media was out to get her, progressives hated her for her faith, critics feared her strength. It was the same move she had perfected under Trump: reframe accountability as persecution, turn every challenge into proof that she was under attack by shadowy forces. Arrogance became her armor. When called out for hypocrisy, she smirked. When pressed for clarity, she stonewalled. When facts contradicted her, she dismissed them outright. She built a career on the belief that stubbornness could masquerade as principle, and that repetition could replace truth. For years, that strategy had worked. But arrogance has a way of breeding blind spots. Sanders had faced journalists, activists, even political opponents, but rarely had she faced someone who could mirror her confidence with authenticity, who could meet her dismissiveness with unflinching composure. She was accustomed to controlling the narrative, to dominating exchanges with volume and certainty. What she hadn't prepared for was a challenger who didn't take the bait, who let silence linger long enough for her contradictions to echo in the air. And that is where Jasmine Crockett entered the story. Crockett was not impressed by family legacies or political polish. She did not see Sanders as untouchable, nor did she accept her victimhood narrative. She came armed not with talking points, but with truth sharpened by lived experience. For the first time, Sanders' usual weapons, arrogance, deflection, condescension, would not shield her. Because in Jasmine Crockett, she wasn't facing a reporter she could ignore or a protester she could dismiss. She was facing a woman who embodied the very community Sanders had spent years undermining. A woman whose voice carried the weight of millions who had grown tired of hypocrisy disguised as leadership. And in that chamber, when the lights burned brightest and the nation unknowingly leaned in, Sarah Huckabee Sanders discovered that her greatest defense had suddenly become her greatest weakness. But against Jasmine Crockett, her usual tactics were about to fail. Jasmine Crockett's story could not be more different from Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Where Sanders was born into power, Crockett was born into a fight. Raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett learned early what it meant to navigate a world that was not built to favor women who looked like her, sounded like her, or came from her background. She carried those lessons with her into adulthood, never once forgetting that dignity, once earned, must be defended at all costs. Before Congress, there was the courtroom. Crockett built her career as a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer in Texas, representing clients who had no one else to turn to. She fought for the poor, for the marginalized, for those swept up by a justice system that too often treated poverty as a crime and race as guilt. While Sanders honed her skill behind podiums, Crockett sharpened hers under fluorescent lights in cramped county courthouses, standing between powerless clients and the full weight of the state. Those experiences forged her steel. She witnessed firsthand how policy wasn't just words on paper but a weapon that could ruin lives. Every case, every client, every unjust ruling deepened her conviction: the law was not neutral, and if no one challenged it, injustice would simply calcify. Unlike Sanders, who had inherited influence, Crockett had to earn her place by pushing back against systems that preferred she stay silent. Her entry into politics wasn't ambition for its own sake. It was necessity. The very communities she defended in court needed more than a lawyer, they needed a voice inside the very halls where laws were written. In Texas, she served in the state legislature, where she gained a reputation for her sharp tongue and even sharper logic. She called out hypocrisy without hesitation, sparred with colleagues who underestimated her, and refused to soften her words to make others comfortable. Her presence was electric, a reminder that truth, when spoken plainly, could be louder than any insult. When Crockett ran for Congress, the establishment did not expect her to succeed. Yet she did, propelled by grassroots support, fueled by voters who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles and their own resilience. She wasn't polished in the way Sanders was, she was real. Where Sanders performed values, Crockett lived them. And that authenticity resonated. In Washington, Crockett quickly distinguished herself as more than a freshman backbencher. She combined fire with composure, a rare balance in politics. When debates grew heated, she didn't shrink or stumble. She leaned in, eyes steady, voice firm. Critics called her too loud, too bold, or too confrontational. But Crockett knew what those labels meant. She wasn't playing the role they wanted her to. She wasn't grateful for scraps. She wasn't waiting her turn. She was demanding space, and making clear she intended to use it. And so, every time she took the floor, she carried with her not just her own determination but the pride of communities who had always been told to wait, to stay quiet, to let others speak for them. She wore their voices like armor. Every barb she endured, every underestimation hurled at her, became fuel. Crockett knew what it meant to be underestimated, and that's what made her dangerous to Sanders. Because Sanders had built her career on underestimating opponents, dismissing critics, and waving away those who lacked her privilege. But Crockett had walked into too many rooms where people doubted her, only to leave those rooms as the one no one could ignore. She had turned underestimation into her greatest strength, flipping it against those who thought her silence was weakness. By the time she sat across from Sanders in that chamber, Crockett's entire life had prepared her for the moment. Every courtroom battle, every legislative showdown, every sneer she had shrugged off was etched into her composure. Her stillness wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And unlike Sanders, Crockett didn't need to shout to be heard. Her power came from precision, from knowing when to let an insult hang long enough to reveal itself as hollow, from knowing when to deliver a single line that would echo louder than an opponent's entire speech. She understood that truth, spoken without fear, could cut deeper than the sharpest insult. As Sanders hurled words in that chamber, trying to bury Crockett under bluster, Crockett's eyes never wavered. Because she knew that the true measure of leadership isn't how loud you can be, but how firmly you can stand when the noise swirls around you. She had been underestimated her whole life. But she had never once let it stop her. And in this moment, with the nation unknowingly watching, she was about to show Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and everyone else, that underestimation was a mistake they would regret. Her counterattack was coming. And when it landed, it would not just silence Sanders. It would send shockwaves far beyond that room. The air in the chamber thickened as the debate moved past pleasantries and into live fire. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, seated with her familiar stiff posture and carefully rehearsed smile, decided it was time to go on offense. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice coated with condescension. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, each syllable dripping with disdain, "you seem to think shouting about problems is the same as solving them. But in Arkansas, we actually get things done. Maybe if Washington had more leaders like me, instead of grandstanders like you, the American people wouldn't feel so abandoned." The words sliced through the room, sharp and deliberate. A few of Sanders' supporters chuckled and clapped, their laughter rising awkwardly in the otherwise tense silence. Crockett did not flinch. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingers interlaced, her eyes locked on Sanders like a hawk studying prey. Sanders pressed harder. She brought up Crockett's background as a civil rights lawyer, attempting to weaponize it. It's easy to grandstand in a courtroom, to play the hero when cameras are rolling. But governance is about making tough choices. Something you wouldn't understand. The crowd stirred, an uneasy mix of gasps, side whispers, and a few scoffs. Some exchanged glances that silently said, "She went there?" Jasmine Crockett still did not move. Her restraint became its own weapon. The silence she held was louder than any interruption, and Sanders, realizing she hadn't rattled her, pushed again. "You know, Congresswoman," Sanders continued with her trademark smirk, "some of us believe in real leadership. You can't just tweet, protest, and posture forever. One day, you actually have to lead. And frankly, I don't think you're ready." This time, the jab landed heavier. Even Crockett's allies shifted uneasily, waiting for her to respond. The room leaned in, half expecting her to explode, to match insult with insult. But she didn't. She let Sanders' words linger in the air, like smoke waiting to choke out its source. Then came the shift. Crockett finally leaned forward, her calm demeanor never wavering. Her voice was steady, clear, and precise. "Governor Sanders," she said evenly, "you keep talking about leadership as though it's some crown you inherited. But leadership isn't about hiding behind slogans. It's about accountability. And that's something you've avoided your entire career." The audience murmured. A ripple of approval ran through the chamber. Sanders frowned. She attempted to laugh it off. "That's cute, Congresswoman. But people in Arkansas elected me because they trust me, not because I play political theater." Crockett tilted her head slightly, studying Sanders with a mix of pity and resolve. "Trust," she repeated, the word heavy with irony. "Governor, when you ban books, silence teachers, and dodge questions about state funds, that's not trust. That's control. And people are tired of being controlled." The reaction was instant. Gasps, applause, even a few cheers from the gallery. Sanders' supporters tried to clap back, but their noise was swallowed by the swell of approval for Crockett's words. Sanders' smile cracked for the first time. She leaned into the mic, voice rising with a touch of panic. This is exactly the problem. You take complex issues and reduce them to sound bites. Governing is about results, not cheap applause lines. Crockett, calm as ever, raised a single eyebrow. Funny. Because when the cameras are off, you reduce people's lives to slogans. Family values. Freedom. But when those families can't afford healthcare, when their children's history is erased from textbooks, where's the freedom then? The crowd erupted. The energy had shifted completely, Sanders no longer the confident commander, but the flustered politician scrambling to regain footing. She shuffled her notes, looking for an escape hatch, while Crockett sat still, her presence growing larger with every word. By now, even those who entered the chamber indifferent were leaning forward in their seats, caught between outrage and admiration. The tension climbed to a breaking point. Sanders' face flushed as she tried to interject again, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, an unspoken signal that the floor belonged to her. The silence that followed was deafening, and then, Crockett leaned forward, eyes unblinking, voice low but cutting enough to pierce the air. And then, the narrator's voice drops, pulling the audience closer. Crockett delivered the line that broke the room. The chamber had grown tense, the kind of silence where every shuffle of paper and every cough echoed. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, visibly unsettled, had been lobbing her usual mix of barbed one-liners and sanctimonious declarations. She was accustomed to rattling her opponents, to projecting confidence until her critics seemed smaller, less credible. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, hands folded, eyes steady, and breathing controlled, like a boxer waiting for the perfect opening. And then, it came. Crockett leaned forward, her tone calm but commanding, the kind of delivery that demanded the entire room lean in. She began not with a roar but with a question. "Governor Sanders," Crockett said, pausing to make sure the words carried, "you speak often about family values. But tell me, what family values are upheld when working families in your state can't afford health care? When women lose the right to make decisions over their own bodies? When transparency in government vanishes the moment questions about your administration arise?" A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some smirked. Others whispered. Sanders forced a smile, trying to brush it off with her trademark dismissive chuckle, but Crockett wasn't finished. She had waited for this. "See, you claim to be the voice of everyday Americans," Crockett continued, her voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs. "But your policies have silenced nurses, teachers, and parents who only want better lives for their kids. You say one thing on camera, but your record tells a very different story." Gasps. Nervous laughter. The crowd felt the shift. Sanders had lost control of the stage. Sanders interjected, her voice sharper now. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, you don't understand the people of Arkansas the way I do. I live among them," but Crockett cut in, her timing impeccable. "You live above them, Governor. You live in a mansion funded by the very people whose struggles you ignore. That's not leadership. That's hypocrisy." The word hypocrisy landed like a gavel slamming down. The audience, staffers, journalists, aides, reacted instinctively. Some cheered, others clapped, and a wave of nervous laughter filled the room. Sanders' face flushed. For the first time, the governor looked rattled. She shifted in her chair, adjusted her notes, glanced toward the cameras. But Crockett was relentless. "You say you want transparency," Crockett said, her voice unwavering, "yet when Arkansas taxpayers asked how money was being spent under your watch, suddenly, the information was hidden. You preach morality, but your administration has been mired in secrecy. Tell me, Governor, what exactly are you hiding from your own people?" The question wasn't just rhetorical. It hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The crowd grew louder, some clapping, some gasping, others exchanging knowing glances. The momentum had shifted entirely. Sanders tried to laugh it off again, a shaky chuckle that betrayed her discomfort. She muttered something about political theater, but her voice cracked ever so slightly. Crockett didn't let go. She slowed down, deliberately pausing after each point, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. "You call yourself a champion of women," she said, locking eyes with Sanders, "but you've stood behind policies that strip women of autonomy. You call yourself a supporter of working families, but you've cut programs that help those very families survive. You claim faith as your guiding light, but somehow, compassion never makes it into your policies." Every line landed harder than the last. The pauses were calculated, and the room responded with audible reactions, claps, gasps, even a few whistles from the back. Sanders' carefully crafted armor of confidence was cracking, and everyone could see it. Sanders' face tightened. She attempted to strike back, to interrupt, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, just enough to signal strength without seeming disrespectful. "I'm not here to play games, Governor," Crockett said firmly. "I'm here because the people who elected me expect honesty. And what they see when they look at your leadership is a gap between what you say and what you do. That gap has a name. It's called dishonesty. And I will not stand here and pretend otherwise." The room erupted. Applause thundered, drowning out Sanders' attempt to respond. Some stood, clapping with energy usually reserved for campaign rallies. Sanders' team shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. Crockett sat back slightly, her expression calm, almost serene. She wasn't gloating, she didn't need to. The silence in Sanders' rebuttal, the eruption of the crowd, and the crack in Sanders' composure told the story, and then, Crockett delivered the final blow. "You can spin words all you want. You can craft speeches about morality, about values, about faith. But leadership isn't about what you say when the cameras are rolling. It's about what you do when the cameras are off. And Governor Sanders, when those cameras turn off, your record speaks for itself. Loudly. Clearly. And shamefully." Boom, the crowd lost it. Cheers, whistles, gasps, the kind of reaction that makes headlines before the transcripts are even released. Reporters in the back scrambled to jot notes, cameras zoomed in on Sanders' increasingly tense face, and Crockett's calm demeanor contrasted so sharply with Sanders' unraveling that the optics alone told the story. Sanders fumbled for words, muttering about fake outrage and media bias, but it was too late. The damage was done. Her usual script, play the victim, deflect criticism, pivot to slogans, was useless against Crockett's steady precision. In that moment, Crockett wasn't just countering an argument. She was exposing a pattern, peeling back layers of contradiction that Sanders had hidden behind for years. Each point dismantled not only Sanders' policies but the persona she had carefully built since her days as Trump's press secretary, and the audience knew it. The applause wasn't just for Crockett's words, it was for the clarity she brought, for the courage to say aloud what many had been whispering. Sanders leaned back, visibly shaken, lips pursed as she tried to regain composure. But her eyes told the truth. This was not a skirmish she had won. This was a moment that would follow her. Meanwhile, Crockett sat back with quiet confidence, letting the noise wash over her. She didn't need to add anything more. The contrast between her poise and Sanders' unraveling was more powerful than any final word. And just when the noise began to settle, Crockett delivered one last line, not shouted, not dramatic, but soft, controlled, and devastating. "Governor Sanders, you may be comfortable hiding behind soundbites. But I deal in truth. And tonight, the truth caught up to you." The chamber exploded one last time. Sanders' face froze. Cameras flashed. The crowd roared. And for the first time in her political career, Sarah Huckabee Sanders had no words left. But the real shock, the one that would ripple across news cycles and social media feeds, came after the cameras stopped rolling. The debate didn't end when the cameras cut. In many ways, that was only the beginning. What happened inside that auditorium in Arkansas was raw, unforgettable, and impossible to contain. Within minutes of the broadcast wrapping, the digital wildfire had begun. The internet takes hold. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of Sarah Huckabee Sanders were snatched, clipped, and hurled onto the internet at light speed. The moment where Crockett leaned forward, cool and composed, and delivered her now legendary takedown was shared in Twitter threads, stitched into TikToks, uploaded as Instagram Reels, and replayed endlessly on YouTube. A single phrase crystallized into a rallying cry, #Crockett exposes Sanders. It was sharp, easy to remember, and spread across platforms like oxygen meeting fire. By sunrise, the hashtag had trended not only nationwide but internationally. Even those who hadn't followed the debate now knew the story. A young, fearless congresswoman had stood her ground and gutted one of the GOP's most combative rising stars. On TikTok, creators slowed down the footage frame by frame, pointing out the way Sanders' smirk cracked into a grimace, how her hands fidgeted beneath the podium, how Crockett paused just long enough to let the weight of her words sink in. Others remixed the exchange with dramatic music, turning it into a moment of political theater that rivaled anything scripted for television. Twitter, or X, as it was now called, was even more brutal. Memes of Sanders looking flustered, paired with sarcastic captions, circulated by the thousands. One viral post read, "She went in with Bible verses and came out looking like a BuzzFeed quiz result. Which hypocrite are you?" The press weighs in. By the next morning, major news outlets couldn't resist. CNN led with, "Crockett's precision strikes leave Sanders reeling." MSNBC's panel of commentators gleefully dissected each blow Crockett landed, with one analyst calling it a masterclass in disciplined debate strategy. Even some conservative outlets, usually quick to shield Sanders, admitted she had been visibly shaken and caught off guard. Columnists churned out think pieces almost as fast as the memes. Some framed it as a generational clash, the old guard of political spin meeting a new wave of blunt, unapologetic truth-telling. Others zoomed in on the hypocrisy angle, arguing that Crockett's performance exposed more than just one politician's contradictions. It tapped into the broader disillusionment with leaders who preached morality while practicing something very different. Celebrities and cultural echoes. Then came the celebrity amplification. Influential voices, from musicians to actors to comedians, began posting their reactions. Comedian Leslie Jones retweeted the clip with the caption, "Phew, she ate that woman alive. Somebody check on Arkansas." Rapper Cardi B chimed in with a simple, "Crockett 2028? Eyes fire," and late-night hosts wasted no time folding the debate into their monologues, replaying Crockett's sharpest lines to roaring laughter from their studio audiences. For once, politics had broken through the noise of streaming shows and celebrity scandals. It had become entertainment, not shallow or trivial, but gripping, consequential, and deeply human. Sanders on the defensive. Meanwhile, Sanders found herself in unfamiliar territory. She was used to spinning, dismissing, and pivoting, but the clip's virality left her little room to maneuver. Her team attempted damage control with carefully worded statements, accusing Crockett of grandstanding for the cameras and playing politics with cheap shots. But the more they pushed, the worse it got. Social media users responded with side-by-side comparisons of Sanders' words and Crockett's receipts. "Cheap shots," one viral tweet replied. "Looks more like accurate aim." Even some Republican strategists privately admitted that Sanders' aura of untouchability had cracked. She hadn't just lost a debate, she had lost control of the narrative. A broader reckoning. The ripple effects went far beyond Sanders herself. Crockett's performance sparked a larger conversation about hypocrisy in leadership. People began asking pointed questions not just about Sanders, but about every politician who built their brand on family values while advancing divisive, destructive policies. In classrooms, teachers used the debate clip to illustrate rhetorical strategies, how restraint can be more powerful than rage, how facts land harder when wrapped in calm confidence. In barbershops and coffee shops, ordinary citizens debated what it meant to finally see someone refuse to back down without sinking to the same level of ugliness. For many, Crockett's victory wasn't just hers. It felt collective. It was a vindication for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to sit down and wait their turn. The legend grows as days passed. The clip became more than a trending moment, it became lore. Students quoted Crockett's lines in campus protests. Activist groups played the footage at rallies. Even digital creators far outside of politics, gamers, lifestyle vloggers, fitness influencers, referenced the moment as shorthand for calling out hypocrisy. Sanders, by contrast, became the butt of a cultural joke. Her carefully crafted image of steely resilience now seemed brittle. Memes compared her to malfunctioning robots, breaking down when met with logic. In every sense of the word, the tables had turned. Crockett was no longer just a rising star. She was a symbol. Cliffhanger, and yet, beyond the viral headlines, the moral of this clash ran much deeper. Because what unfolded in that debate hall wasn't only about two women on a stage, it was about the future of political truth-telling itself. And the question remained, would this shockwave merely entertain, or would it fundamentally reshape the battlefield ahead? As the echoes of applause faded and the cameras powered down, Jasmine Crockett did not retreat into celebration. Instead, she stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just occurred. The chamber was no longer merely a stage for confrontation, it had become a testament to the enduring power of principle over pretense. Crockett knew that what she had accomplished went far beyond a single debate. It was a lesson in leadership, integrity, and courage that the nation desperately needed. She reframed the moment not as a victory over an opponent, but as a triumph of dignity over arrogance. Every pointed retort, every calm pause, every deliberate word had underscored a simple truth: character matters. Actions speak louder than slogans. Authenticity outshines performative rhetoric. In the contrast between her composure and Sanders' unraveling, the lesson was clear: no amount of inherited influence or theatrical bravado could substitute for genuine integrity. The broader takeaway extended beyond politics. Crockett's stand became a mirror for anyone who had ever faced dismissal or condescension. The struggle between what is convenient to say and what is necessary to do, between appearance and reality, played out in households, workplaces, and communities across the country. In her quiet defiance, Crockett offered proof that the fight for truth and fairness is not abstract, it is lived, it is embodied, and it is contagious. This moment also crystallized a fundamental principle about leadership itself: hypocrisy may temporarily dominate headlines, but integrity leaves a lasting imprint. For every Sanders-style spectacle that seeks to manipulate perception, there exists a Crockett-style resilience that quietly reshapes the narrative. Leaders may rise and fall, but dignity always outlives dishonesty. It is this permanence of moral authority, this quiet but unshakable force, that forms the backbone of enduring leadership. Crockett's example resonated especially for women, immigrants, and marginalized communities who had been told to shrink, to silence, or to accept incremental gains at the expense of justice. By refusing to bend to intimidation, she illuminated a path forward, that true influence comes not from loudness, but from consistency, not from fear, but from unwavering commitment to principles. She became not just a politician in that moment, but a symbol of possibility. Audiences watching the clip did more than cheer, they saw themselves in her composure, her intellect, her courage. Her fight against Sanders' theatrics and evasions became a blueprint for challenging injustice in daily life, whether it be confronting unfair policies, standing up to workplace inequities, or refusing to accept small-mindedness disguised as authority. Crockett's victory was universal. It belonged to anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. The crescendo of this moral lesson was not loud or performative. It was found in the quiet confidence Crockett carried as she left the chamber. The headlines and memes would fade, the social media firestorms would calm, but the principle endured. Leadership is measured not by how aggressively one attacks, but by how consistently one upholds truth, how fiercely one defends dignity, and how courageously one acts even when cameras are off. In the end, the story of that debate transcended politics. It became a reminder that personal integrity is the cornerstone of influence, that courage in the face of arrogance is contagious, and that the impact of moral clarity outlives any temporary scandal or spectacle. Crockett's calm defiance left the nation with a timeless lesson: authenticity, truth, and respect for others are the true currencies of power. As the dust settled, viewers were left with an unshakable sense of empowerment. If one woman could stand unflinching against privilege, arrogance, and performance politics, then anyone, anywhere, could find the courage to stand for what is right. The fight was not over, the battles would continue, but one thing had been made undeniably clear: leaders may rise and fall, but dignity always outlives dishonesty. This wasn't just a moment, it was a message. Jasmine Crockett's calm, precise dismantling of Sarah Huckabee Sanders wasn't merely a victory in a single debate, it was a declaration that integrity, courage, and dignity will always outshine arrogance and hypocrisy. The headlines, the viral clips, the social media frenzy, they matter. But what matters more is the lesson that resonates far beyond the chamber walls: leadership rooted in truth and principle can move a nation, inspire a generation, and hold the powerful accountable. For every person watching, this was a reminder that standing up for what is right is never a small act. Crockett's example shows that even against well-practiced rhetoric and polished posturing, authenticity wins. Her victory is proof that measured words, unwavering courage, and a steadfast commitment to justice can create ripples that outlast any viral moment or political stunt. If you were inspired by what you saw, now is the time to act. Subscribe to the channel to follow the stories that matter, share this video so others can witness the power of courage in action, and comment below to join the conversation, because your voice, just like Crockett's, has the power to challenge the status quo. Because tomorrow, another battle for dignity begins, and you won't want to miss it. The fights for justice, truth, and integrity never pause, and neither should we. Watch closely, stay engaged, and remember, history is shaped not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who stand firm in their principles. Every moment matters. Every voice counts. And every story, like Crockett's, reminds us that when dignity meets courage, the world takes notice.